At the 2024 Olympic Games in Paris, France, the U.S. men's gymnastics team won their first Olympic medal since 2008. Immediately following the competition, members of the media and members of the men's program immediately credited the D-Score bonus program for their success, but no publicly available data has been used to substantiate or deny those claims. In this episode 51, we are going to go over all of the data that I have collected from 2018 to 2024 to see, did the men's bonus program actually work? For those new here, my name is Kensley, and I'm the host of Neutral Deductions, a podcast all about men's gymnastics.
This is the Neutral Deductions podcast, men's gymnastic news, coverage, and analysis.
I have to tell you that this is the podcast that I have been looking forward to the absolute most. This is probably the podcast that I'm most excited to do, maybe of all time. And I love data, I love men's gymnastics, and I was able to combine my love of many different disciplines to sort of see, did this program that USA Gymnastics implemented for the men's program actually work? Did it do anything, or was it completely and totally useless? Now, before we dive into the actual nitty gritty of the data, there are a ton of limitations that came with this study. And so right off the bat, I want to address, this is not a perfect study. There really is not enough data, in my opinion, to say, yes, the program worked, or no, the program didn't work. There's only 2 years of data post bonus system implementation. That's not a lot of data points to compare. And if you're looking at the 2023 World Gymnastics Championships, a lot of the top athletes from China and Japan weren't present because the 2023 World Gymnastics Championships was happening simultaneously with the Asian Games. So that's something that we have to keep in mind when we sort of look at the deficits that was happening during that time. Because of the COVID-19 pandemic, there was an additional year in the 2020 Olympic cycle, which meant that subsequently there was a year missing in the 2024 Olympic cycle. So you have a 5-year Olympic cycle compared to a 3-year Olympic cycle. And then you have the different formats that happened. For the 2020 Olympics, they used a 4-member Olympic team. And for the 2024 Olympic cycle, they used a 5-member team. There's so many more things, like the code of points aren't exactly similar. There were some changes that were made over time. And while routine composition was overall kind of similar and scores were actually pretty similar across the board, they're not identical. So there's all of these if, ands, or buts that don't make this a perfect study. But that being said, I do think it's important to dive into the data to see, what do we know, what do we not know, what was good, what was bad, and maybe how that they can grow in the future. So when I decided to take on this project, I had this idea that I would very simply just compare the World Championships team scores and the Olympic team scores. So how did the U.S. measure up against the world, specifically against China, Great Britain, Japan, and Russia for the 2020 Olympic cycle? And then, of course, Russia didn't compete in the 2024 Olympic cycle. And the results that I came away with were really confusing, and I didn't know what to do with them. And I realized that this was actually going to be a much bigger project than I had anticipated. And so I actually enlisted some help from a couple of people, from Yaroslav and from Caitlin, and I can't thank them enough for their help in collecting the data and helping me analyze the data as well. So when I initially started to put in the data from the 2018 World Championships to the 2024 Olympic Games, initially what I saw, just right off the bat, was this program maybe didn't work. The very first thing that I wanted to look at was to see if Team USA had been able to close the gap to the gold medal winners. So I looked at the D-score differential from the 2020 Olympic champions, which was Russia, to the USA, and they had a 4.2 deficit. And then in 2024, Japan won gold, and then I looked at their differential to the US, and it was only 4 points. And immediately I thought, I was like, oh my gosh, the D-score program didn't work. This is not good, because they had put so much time and so much effort into this program. So I was like, okay, I need to look at more than that. I need to look at at averages of Japan and China because part of the goal was to close the gap to both teams. I needed to look at averages over time. And so that was the next thing that I ended up looking at. So looking at averages of team difficulty from 2018 to 2021, remember the 2020 Olympics took place in 2021, compared to the team averages from the 2024 Olympic cycle. Team USA by average actually closed the D-score gap to Japan and China by 1.883 points. So I had this conflicting data of it didn't really close the D-score gap at all to the gold medal winners, but Team USA closed the gap by average over the Olympic cycle to Japan and China both by almost 2 points. So I started talking with some of the other data scientists that I was working with, and I started talking to some judges and some coaches, and we came up with this idea of, okay, maybe I needed to also look at the E-score elements as well. And so this is sort of the hierarchy of how I decided how was I going to actually approach the data that I was giving and what was I going to actually do with it. So when looking at the execution scores, there was actually some really surprising findings, some things that I did not expect at all. And I don't think, at least I have never heard any of the people who were involved in the creation of this bonus system say that the purpose of this program was to increase execution scores. But that is seemingly what actually the program had more of an effect on. So from the 2018 World Championships to the 2020 Olympic Games, the US only increased their execution scores by 1.2 points. But from the 2022 World Championships to the 2024 Olympic Games, the US actually increased their execution score by over 11 points. And when I saw that number, I was blown away. I could not believe it. And I'll get into that in just a moment about why I think that has actually happened. But like my mind was completely and totally blown when I saw that. And I think that this is even more substantiated or backed up by the fact that in 2021 at the 2020 Olympics, the US had an execution deficit to gold to Russia of over 4 points, 4.306 points. But at the 2024 Olympic Games, they exceeded their E-score to the gold medal winning team by over 2 points. Not only that, but their execution score during team finals at the Olympic Games was the highest team execution score of any team at a World Championships or Olympic Games during the entire 2024 Olympic cycle. And if you include the previous Olympic cycle, the 2020 Olympic cycle, their team total at the 2024 Olympics ranks third overall, only behind Russia at the 2019 World Championships and the 2020 Olympic Games. So I saw this data and I was like, okay, there's clearly something happening here. So I think what happened is that the US implemented this bonus system in 2022. They said, we are tired of being behind the rest of the world. We have to try something to increase the D scores of our Olympic team members and our world team members. And we're going to see if we can motivate them by adding in a bonus program. And the reason that they wanted to add in this bonus program is because athletes on the national team had very frankly said, hey, like we're unwilling to upgrade because what happens when we upgrade is we tend to fall more. And when we fall more, we place worse. And then we maybe lose our spot on national team, which means that we lose our national team funding. And so ultimately, you as the leadership have proven to us that it's actually not worth upgrading. And so the idea with this bonus system was to cancel out a fall that would happen for trying a really difficult skill, to say, hey, we're going to reward you for trying this because we understand that maybe some of these new skills can't be learned and implemented in 6 months or a year, and you need some time and you need some buffer. And so they did. Brett McClure said in the men's program committee minutes after the 2022 national championships that the D-score bonus program was working. And our data confirms that. At the 2022 national gymnastics championships, that was the highest D-score that they have had from 2018 to 2024. Now, what happened is there was like this little bit of an inverse relationship. So they increased their difficulty score and their execution score really suffered. And then what happened was, as the D-score program waned, their execution scores started to increase. And so you saw this direct inverse relationship. And I think that that's really fascinating. And I'm curious to see how they'll take that into account when programming and planning the next bonus system for the next year. So in sort of like looking overall, like, did the D-score bonus system work? Did it not work? As I mentioned, there's really evidence for both. And that's why I sort of would say to use caution to anyone in the men's program who are emphatically saying that the program worked, because as a data analyst, I don't think that there's actually enough evidence to say that it worked. And I don't think that there's enough evidence to say that it didn't work. I think that their data can be skewed and shown any way that you want it to. And so what I've tried to do here is provide a very balanced view of the things that worked and the things that didn't. So the ways that the bonus system worked is that over time, over averages, the US did close the D-score gap to major teams like Japan and China. And that is really encouraging. Now, I would say take caution from that, because again, at that 2023 World Championships, a lot of the major players weren't there. And so it really is outlier data, and it's hard to compare apples to apples. So what I did to sort of mitigate that was look at only Olympic years when they did have more or less full difficulty teams. And the US was still able to close the gap by about 1.65 points in the Olympic years. I think that that's really encouraging. When I started looking at national data, because some of the judges and the coaches suggested, well, one of the main goals of this difficulty score bonus program was to increase the difficulty of the pool of athletes, right? We knew that the team for this past Olympics, the 2024 Olympics, could have been chosen by math. So they wanted to increase the pool of difficulty and then sort of see where everything fell. So from the 2021 National Gymnastics Championships to the 2022 National Gymnastics Championships, when they actually implemented that bonus system, the US, the top 8 all-arounders by average increased their difficulty by over half a point, by 0.669. That's huge. Like, that's a really, really big jump. And so I think that's encouraging that at the full difficulty that they were making those strides to add in more difficulty. We also saw that US athletes were increasing they were getting closer to athletes on both still rings and parallel bars, looking at top 8 in the world there. And when looking at individual event data, we did choose to only look at qualifying data, because anything can happen in event finals, right? People fall, they end up with weird difficulty scores, weird execution scores. And so we felt like, because the men's program uses the qualification data, that we should also use the qualification data when making those comparisons. As I mentioned earlier, there were also significant indicators that the D-score bonus system actually didn't work. So from 2018 to 2021, so that was that first Olympic cycle we looked at, there was a 1.4 point increase in difficulty score from the first major competition in the Olympic cycle to the final year, 2021. And then in this most recent Olympic cycle, there was only a 0.3 increase in D-score, meaning more difficulty was added over time in the Olympic cycle pre-bonus system than there was in post-bonus system. Then I looked at, okay, well, let's look at the pre-Olympic World Championships to each subsequent Olympic Games, so 2019 to 2021, and then 2023 to 2024. The increase in D-score was identical. It was 0.4. So again, you're saying, like, did this D-score actually do anything? And then, as I mentioned at the top of this podcast, when looking at the deficit to the gold medal winners at the Olympic Games, at the 2020 Olympics, it was 4.2 points. And at the 2024 Olympics, it was 4.0 exactly. It doesn't seem to indicate that maybe that the bonus system worked. So then I started looking at domestic data. So the US actually increased the deficit to the world on floor exercise and pommel horse. On high bar, there was barely any change in closing the gap to the world, only 0.031, so less than a tenth. And there was actually a decrease overall in averages among the top 8 all-arounders from the 2021 Olympic trials to the 2024 Olympic trials as well. So again, some of this really interesting mixed match of data that some says, hey, like, look how good we did, and others just like, wow, that's really concerning. So what does this actually mean? I think one of the main things to take into account is that it's plausible that the lack of growth during the 2024 Olympic cycle is simply due to the fact that because the bonus system was implemented at the top of the Olympic cycle in 2022, that the athletes that were in that pool just simply maxed their difficulty at the front end of the cycle. And the reason that I think this is most likely the case is when you look at all the other major teams, when you look at Japan, at Great Britain, at China, all of those teams decreased their difficulty from the 2020 Olympics, which took place in 2021, to the 2022 World Gymnastics Championships. Only of the major players, only the US increased their difficulty from the 2020 Olympics to the 2022 World Championships. And so I think that that is something to really take into account, that is probably a huge contributing factor to why that growth was so small in the 2024 Olympic cycle. Another encouraging thing for this men's bonus program, and why I don't think they should throw the baby out with the bathwater just because there's some data that indicates maybe it didn't work, is because there was such a huge jump in execution scores that I think the high likelihood of that being related to the difficulty bonus program, it is so high, even though we know like correlation doesn't equal causation, yada, yada, yada. But it's something that has to be taken into account. So I think with the US athletes being able to sort of have this freebie to try harder skills, and they kept doing harder and harder. I think of like Steven Nedorosic's pommel horse routine. At one point, he was working up to a 7.0 pommel horse routine. He only ended up competing, I think, a 6.4 at the Olympic Games, so that's 0.6 less in difficulty. He probably felt pretty comfortable with that and able to be like, hey, I'm actually decreasing a lot of difficulty. I think about Paul Judah, who was working on the Yurchenko double pike and competed that at the 2023 World Championships. And ultimately he decided that wasn't best for him. And so he downgraded to the 2.5, and he basically stuck the heck out of that vault and was able to score really well. That probably felt really easy for him compared to the Yurchenko double pike. And there's numerous other examples of other athletes who were putting in these really hard skills earlier in the Olympic cycle, and then they decided to pull back. And at the Olympic Games, the US team did not compete their most difficult scores, but yet they had the highest execution of any team that entire Olympic cycle. Like, there has to be something said for that. And so I think more data should be looked at over this upcoming Olympic cycle to see if there is more evidence to support that having that really high D score and then pulling back affects the execution score. And I know anecdotally, certainly on the women's side of things, this is very common. Simone Biles' first coach, Amy Borman, talked about this, how she was constantly having Simone train much harder skills in the gym, like significantly harder. And then they would pull back for their routines. And so I'm really interested to see how that data evolves over time. When I was talking to a few of the coaches, they did bring up the point that they felt like maybe this data wasn't representative of the full growth of difficulty scores within the US, because the US did not send their highest difficulty scoring team to the Olympic Games. And that is completely true. If you had Coy on the team, if you had Yule on the team, if you had Donnell on the team, you would have seen actually a pretty significant increase in difficulty score for that US Olympic team. But I don't think that that's actually really worthwhile investigating, because I could spend an hour talking about the what ifs of D scores. For example, at the 2020 Olympics and the 2024 Olympic Games, China did not send their team with the highest possible D score. In 2020, it was due to injury. Zhang Boheng was not on that team due to politics. And then in 2024, Sun Wei got injured and they had to bring in Su Weida, and they lost some D score there. And so I could play what ifs all day long. If Su Weida hadn't fallen 3 times on high bar, like their difficulty score would have been much higher. But I think it's better to take a look at what actually happened, how the judges judged in those situations, and use what is actually there in front of us. So based on the evidence that I have presented today, several people have asked me, like, well, would you have the men's program continue with the bonus system if you were in charge of it? And what I have to say to that is that there's really no conclusive evidence that the bonus program worked, but there is certainly no evidence to suggest that it was hurtful to the men's program. In fact, I would even go as far as to say there is some evidence to suggest that the program was an overall positive. So with that being said, because it's not hurting the program and because there is some evidence that, like, basically, right, it's either they sort of stayed the same, or by some metrics they did improve, right? We didn't see a lot of like, oh, well, they got a lot worse. So with that being said, because they've only have 2 years to implement the data, I would certainly recommend continuing with the bonus program for the 2028 Olympic cycle. But I think it would be in their best interest to potentially look at making some tweaks to the program. Now, the U.S. men's program, to my knowledge, has not come out with their official statement about what their goals are for the 2028 Olympic Games. I don't know if their goal is simply to win a medal. I don't know if their goal is to bring home gold on home soil like they did in 1984, which would certainly be poetic because both of those games are going to be in Los Angeles. But I think one of the things that they could consider tweaking is, instead of having a D-score bonus system that decreases over time in, like, let's say they have 1 point of D-score bonus in 2025 and like 0.75 bonus in 2026 and 0.5 bonus in 2027 and then no bonus in 2028. I think it could be interesting to see if you kept the full bonus system up until the 2028 Winter Cup. And the reason that I say that is because the men's program has mentioned that they have a concern that lowering the D-score bonus value would not necessarily be incentive enough to have athletes push the difficulty. So if you kept the full D-score difficulty in line until 2028 Winter Cup, it allows athletes still that buffer up until the very first part of the Olympic year. And that would ultimately have an impact on the pool of athletes that would be making the Olympic team, because Winter Cup is potentially going to be the very last qualifier to the 2028 National Gymnastics Championship. So they don't usually have another qualifier that year. And as of now, they are not considering the NCAA championships as a qualifier either. So I kind of like this idea of maybe stopping the bonus program at the 2028 Winter Cup. Now, some coaches have said that they think that the bonus system should go all the way through 2028 Olympic trials. And I completely, totally, 100% wholeheartedly disagree with that. You should not be using fake numbers to choose an Olympic team. Like, I cannot tell you how strongly I feel about that. You should not be using fake numbers to choose an Olympic team where they are going to be using a completely different set of rules. If you want to use fake numbers to choose your national team, I don't really have a problem with that because there's like a certain incentive behind it. But when you are choosing people to compete at international competitions, you need to choose them based on the rule book that is going to be used to judge them at that competition. So that's my little spiel on that section. Now, another way I think that they could refine the bonus program is, I think that instead of gradually decreasing the D-score bonus program, I think that they could actually add in an execution score component. So from let's say 2025 is the first year of the Olympic cycle, they could just have the high level bonus system with no execution contingencies. And then in 2026, which would be the second year, you could do something like an 8-0 contingency, which is like an okay E-score. It's not great. It's not awful. And then 2027, you could do something like an 8.3 contingency to get the D-score bonus. And then in 2028, you could do something really impressive like an 8.5 E-score, which is probably what the top guys at the Olympic Games are probably going to be looking at. Now, all of this gets really hard to decide and implement because the everything in men's gymnastics is going belly up right now. They're completely changing the code of points. They're changing routine construction like none other. And so these are just like general ideas that I have, and they're not necessarily reflective of what exactly would be a good execution score in the next code of points. Now, the final thing I'll say about all of this is that if the men's program, if they have a desire to get gold, I think it might be time to take an even more radical approach. I have long argued that I think the timing of the NCAA season is really detrimental to the elite program and their upgrades. And I think that the men's program could make some really radical decisions, like picking a group of people that they think are their like A team and say, hey, we want you to sit out the 2025 World Championships. It's like this individual World Championships. We want you to only focus on upgrade. We don't want you to focus on getting in routine shape, because what happens is like athletes are like, they're having to peak so often if they're doing NCAA. And I've talked to enough coaches and I've talked to enough athletes to firmly believe that there just is not enough time to put in the necessary upgrades to really compete with China and Japan. And they could also consider another page out of the women's playbook, which is you have athletes like Jordan Chiles or some of the other elite athletes, Suni Lee, who stopped doing NCAA, went to their home gym for a year, focused strictly on elite, and then were able to make the Olympic team. Now, Jordan has gone back to NCAA. It doesn't mean that you're done with NCAA, your career at all. It's just saying that for this particular year, I'm not sure that doing both is in my best interest. It doesn't have to be the case for all people. Jade Carey certainly competed NCAA and was still able to maintain and do both, but it could be an option because not all athletes are the same. Not all athletes need the same program. And so I think something radical could be important if they are looking to go for that gold medal. Now, all of the data that I used for this analysis, I've made open source. I really strongly believe in open source data because even though we have like double and triple checked this data, we are certainly human and mistakes could be made. And so I would encourage you to run your own data sets to see what information that you're able to find. So all of that is available on the website in the article, and it just links to Excel documents that you can view only. And I hope that you found all of this really interesting. I would love to hear your thoughts on this podcast. I would love to know what you think of the D-score bonus system, what your perception was before hearing this data. Maybe did it change after hearing this data? All of that's really important to me and interesting. So please feel free to email me at neutraldeductions@gmail.com. Also, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. This is super, super important. If you are listening on YouTube, please leave us comments. I love to read them. I love to learn more, even if it's critical. It's part of the learning process. If it's positive, definitely leave a comment and hit the like button and subscribe. This was a lot of work. This was like 100 hours of data and analysis. So if you've been waiting for the holiday time to see if you have money to make some donations, if like 100 people donated $25, that would feel like that the time put into this was well worth it, because it really took a lot of time to compile, analyze, have meetings with the other data analysts doing this project. So thank you again so much for tuning in, for listening. I hope you found this as interesting as I did, and I will most certainly see you next time.